Greetings. It's been a while since I've posted a video and I apologize for that, but I wanted to be more certain of what I was going to present before I posted a new video. And today I'd like to present a new hypothesis on the 70th week of Daniel and the possibility that maybe we were forewarned 7 years in advance of when it would begin. Before I get started, I'd just like to give a shout out to Nelson Walters and Ryan Rigo, both of whom contributed to this video and to our discussions about what we're going to present today. You may recall on August 21st, 2017, there was a total solar eclipse that crossed the United States prior to the sign of the woman in labor. And then on September 23rd of 2017, just over a month later, we had the famous sign of the woman in labor, the woman of Revelation 12, where Virgo was clothed with the sun, had a crown of 12 stars, was in labor with Jupiter, and the moon was at her feet. Now, it turns out that in the fall of 2017, there were several geopolitical events that occurred in association with these celestial alignments. On the 21st of August, the very day of the solar eclipse, Jared Kushner flew to Saudi Arabia to initially present for the first time the deal of the century. On the 20th of September, President Abbas presented to the UN General Assembly his demands for a two-state solution in order to have peace and security in the Middle East with the State of Israel. Then on the 22nd of September was the Feast of Trumpets, followed the very next day by the sign of the woman in labor. And then finally on the 25th of October, the finalized deal of the century was presented again by Jared Kushner to Saudi Arabia and to Mohammed bin Salman, the finalization which eventually became the Abraham Accords. And something that caught our eye on the 23rd of September of this year, the Saudi foreign minister gave a speech to the UN General Assembly on the exact day of the 6th anniversary of the sign of the woman in labor. And in that speech, he discussed the necessity for a two-state solution in order to have peaceful relations with Israel. And as you know, there's been a push by the United States pushing for a two-state solution and to have Saudi Arabia join the Abraham Accords. So there has been, as I said, a big push to have Saudi join the Abraham Accords, but the price for that would be that Israel would have to give up claim to some of the land of the everlasting covenant. And this seemed to be on track. Possibly they could have reached an agreement even by the end of this year, but then the sudden surprise invasion of Israel by Hamas in the Simchat Torah war has probably pushed any talk of that off until 2024 at the earliest. Something else of interest is that in a year, on the 23rd of September of next year, the UN has scheduled its Summit for the Future, the Pact for the Future, to discuss how the world will govern itself going forward. And what we think may happen would be that a Saudi-Israeli peace agreement would be rolled into this Pact for the Future and be presented to the UN on September 23rd, the 7-year anniversary of the sign of the woman in labor. So the idea that the UN Pact for the Future on the 23rd of September of next year might be rolled into a Israeli-Saudi peace plan at the same time, on the anniversary date of the sign of the woman in labor, caused us to wonder if in fact the celestial events of 2017 to 2024 were a preview for what was going to come in the 7-year period from 2024 to 2031. We know that division of the land of the everlasting covenant mentioned in Genesis 17 and also in Psalm 105 and 1 Chronicles 16, we know that the vision of the land of the everlasting covenant is the proximate cause of judgment at the time of the end. Joel chapter 3 says, I will gather all the nations and bring them to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. And then again in Isaiah 24, verse 6, the earth is also defiled by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, and they violated statutes, and they broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. And therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men will be left. So if we believe that there's a possibility, if we have a hypothesis that the celestial alignments and geopolitical events of 2017 to 24 were a 7-year in advance preview for what was going to come during the 70th week of Daniel, we have to ask, do we have any scriptural references that would support this? And in fact, we do. In Genesis 41, Joseph interpreted the dream of 7 years of preparation in order to be ready for the 7 years of famine that were coming. Also in Genesis 7, Noah received a 7-day advance warning before the wrath of the flood began. So we do have a precedence in Scripture of 7 years or in 7 days warning in advance. So what kinds of events did we see in the period from 2017 up until today? Well, from 2018 to 2022, there were a series of locust swarms in Eastern Africa and the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, and the Middle East that were unprecedented in size for decades. And these have subsided some, but what we might anticipate, if this was a 7-year in advance warning, that maybe from the years 2025 to 2029, we might see something like this, although amplified many times. Then we had COVID-19, which began in January of 2020. And so what we might anticipate, if this was a 7-year in advance preview, we might anticipate a much worse plague beginning in maybe 2027 that would be many times worse than what we've already experienced. Did the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, does that presage a possible much worse confrontation between Western globalism and maybe the BRICS countries, maybe to begin in 2029, 7 years after this particular invasion? When the COVID pandemic hit, governments began to print money, and now we have worldwide inflation, which has been very difficult to get under control. And although it's come down here recently, the last few months, we've actually seen a rebound, and it's higher than it's been for decades. People are having a hard time affording food. India has quit exporting rice. Food shortages and food inflation are going on around the world, and maybe we'll see something even more significant in the period beginning 2027 and moving forward from there with economic collapse. And then finally, this month, the Hamas invasion of Israel with unprecedented casualties suffered by the Israelis. More Jews were killed in one day than were killed since the Holocaust, according to news reports. This possibly presages the final invasion of Israel, which 7 years from now would put it in 2030 and may be representative of the Gog-Magog-Zechariah war. Well, if the geopolitical events and celestial alignments of 2017 to 24 are a preview for 2024 to 2031, we would want to know what is the structure of the 70th week of Daniel in that event. So we would begin the 70th week on the Feast of Trumpets here on the 2nd of October. The Feast of Trumpets is one of the feasts that has not been fulfilled yet. The first 4 feasts in the Jewish cycle have been fulfilled already. It would be exactly 1,290 days then to the middle of Passover week on 14th of April, 2028. And this would be the day that we would anticipate the abomination of desolation spoken of in Daniel 9. And from there, it's exactly 1,260 days. That would correspond to the Great Tribulation, which begins after the abomination of desolation, as Jesus spoke of in the Olivet Discourse. 1,260 days brings you exactly to the Day of Atonement on the 27th of September, 2031. And that's a period of now of 7 years, or 2,550 days. Now, the 1,290 days of Daniel 12 would land on the 27th of October, 2031. On the Jewish calendar, that's the 10th day of the second month, the month of Cheshvan. That happens to be the very day that Noah was told to enter the ark because the rain would start 7 days later. And after he got on the ark, he never saw another unbeliever because they were wiped out in the wrath of the flood. So we think that this may represent the separation of the sheep and the goats after the Battle of Armageddon. Then it's 1,335 days from the middle of Passover week, and that happens to land exactly on the first day of Hanukkah, which would represent the dedication of the new temple. Now, the middle of Passover week would be the 14th of April of 2028. And it's 3.5 years then to the end. It's also 3.5 cycles of Jewish feasts, the Moedim. And that's because in the middle of the week, Passover and first fruits have already passed. You have 3 full cycles, and then you have a half a cycle that consists of half of the week of unleavened bread, Shavuot, or Pentecost, and then Feast of Trumpets, and then Day of Atonement. And at that point, the 70th week would be over 3.5 years later and 3.5 Moedim cycles later. So it's interesting to look back to see in the heavens what was going on at the time of the middle of Passover week back in 2021, which would be at the midpoint of the 2017 to 2024 period. And what we find is, we find Saturn here right in the middle of Capricorn. So you have the Satanic planet in the middle of the Satanic constellation. Pluto, or Hades, is following Saturn here. Saturn was death, Pluto is Hades. So we have Hades following death in the middle of Passover week, which would be when the abomination of desolation would have been predicted. And I think that this may presage what we're going to see in 2028. Now, on April 1st, 2021, again, the middle of Passover week in that year, it just is interesting that the Saudi foreign minister, the same fellow that gave the speech this year at the UN General Assembly, was also quoted as saying that he was looking forward to having peace with Israel, except that it would come at the expense of a two-state solution with Israel giving up rights to Judea and Samaria, the land of the everlasting covenant, and then it's only after that that they would be able to have peaceful relations. So it makes me wonder then if this is a preview of what we might expect in the middle of Passover week at the abomination of desolation, if it would not be in some way connected to an Israeli-Saudi peace arrangement based on Israel giving up its right to its land. Looking forward to this spring, there's the second of 2 solar eclipses to cross the United States on the 8th of April, 2024. And since the first eclipse was closely associated with Kushner going to Saudi Arabia to present the deal of the century, it makes one wonder if we might see some form of an announcement of a preliminary agreement between the two nations in association with this eclipse that again is being pushed by the United States. And you've probably seen this map that shows the two eclipses, and where they cross is in the area of Illinois known as Little Egypt. And in the sense that Egypt was the womb of the first nation of Israel, and the United States is the second womb for the second nation of Israel, there are some interesting parallels between Egypt and the United States. Now, back in 2023, there was a celestial alignment that I wanted to review. We had Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, otherwise known as Zedek to the Hebrews, is moving across the sky, and it's approaching Pleiades. Pleiades representing believers, the seven stars. Now, in between the two is the planet in Greek, Uranos, representing the heavens. That's the meaning of it. And so what we have is that Zedek, representing the Messiah, is approaching the believers. From the believer's standpoint, he's approaching from the heavens. Now, Zedek continued to approach the believers right up until the Feast of Trumpets on the 16th of September 2023. This is as close as it came. And then once it reached that point, it went backwards into Aries the ram. Now, from a pre-wrath resurrection and gathering perspective, this would suggest that the resurrection and gathering might be associated with the Feast of Trumpets 7 years later in 2030. And that's just from the pre-wrath perspective. And we understand others have other ideas about that, but it is a pictorial representation for what we think may happen 7 years hence. Now, if we look forward 7 years from the Feast of Trumpets in 2023, what we find is an alignment that is interesting, that was pointed out to us by my colleague Ryan Rigo. Once again, we have the woman, and she has a crown of 12, the 9 stars of Leo plus Mars, Mercury, and Venus. She's clothed with the sun. The moon is at her feet. The difference is that the sign of the woman in labor back in 2017, Jupiter was in the womb. But what we find now is that Jupiter is in the throne. And we believe that the suggested alignment in 2023 at the Feast of Trumpets presages this alignment, and we believe that the resurrection and gathering are represented here with Jupiter being taken to the throne with an empty womb. And this would, in effect, complete the sign of the woman in labor all the way back to 2017. Now, Noah was on the ark on the 10th day of the second month, but the flood began on the 17th day. He got off the ark on the 27th day of the second month, a year later, which means he was spared from the wrath of the flood for a year and 10 days. If the resurrection and gathering occurs as we believe it will, possibly on or around the Feast of Trumpets in 2030, and the 70th week ends a year and 10 days later on the Day of Atonement, then believers also will be protected as Noah was for a year and 10 days. And we don't know the day or the hour of the resurrection or gathering because it's a 2-day holiday and we don't know when the new moon crescent will be sighted or what hour of the evening that will be. But we will be very close to knowing the season, the month, and possibly even the week of the resurrection and gathering, if this hypothesis is true. Now in Revelation 15, the sign of the 7 angels, John mentions that he saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast in his image and the number of his name standing on the sea of glass. Maybe John had this in mind when he made that statement. And in May 2024, beginning on the 3rd of May and lasting through the 11th of May, we have a celestial alignment that suggests what John recorded. We have the 7 moving objects in a straight line over the celestial sea, mixed with fire, the sun, and Pleiades is standing on top of the sea. So we believe this is a pictorial representation of the sign of the 7 angels. Now the 7 angels empty their bowls of wrath, and during that period in May of 2024, and it's 5 months then to the Day of Atonement, October the 12th. And what we're wondering, is this a preview for 2031? Will we see the bowls of wrath poured out then, 7 years later, beginning about 5 months before the Day of Atonement? Now, this coming spring in May, I expect that we'll get a preview. So I'm expecting that April and May will be fairly unpleasant here on Earth. And then we have the angels standing in the sun on the 2nd of October 2024, the evening prior to the onset of the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah. John recorded in Revelation 19, verses 15 to 18, "Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying to all the birds which fly in mid-heaven, Come assemble for the great supper of God." So does the annular eclipse on the 2nd of October 2024, does that presage the Battle of Armageddon on the evening of the Feast of Trumpets 2031, and which would end on the Day of Atonement? So on the 2nd of October, when we have the annular eclipse on Yom Teruah, not only might that presage the Battle of Armageddon 7 years later, but it also is a marker for the onset of the 70th week. So that is our working hypothesis, that the celestial alignments and geopolitical events of 2017 to 2024 were given 7 years in advance so that we could prepare for what may be coming in 2024 to 2031. And it's a hypothesis. We'll know by next fall if this is true or not. But this is what we're currently thinking, in which case we're at the cusp of the beginning of the 70th week. And for those of you who may not know the Lord as your Savior, I would just like to mention the verse in Joel about these times, chapter 2, verse 32, that whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved during that time. And as always, shalom, and remember that He is sovereign and in complete control. Nothing catches Him by surprise. Thank you, and until next time, good evening.